Welcome back to the Engineered Angler. Today we're doing a master class. This is a topic you guys really wanted to hear about. It's a master class on weight and balance, understanding how much weight to put in your lure and where to put it. And if you're new to this channel, my name's Franco. I'm a professional engineer, a lure builder and lure designer, and I make these videos to add just a little bit of physics and engineering into the art of lure making and to help out fellow lure makers. My goal in this video is to try to make the information as usable and applicable as possible. So I'm going to cover not only crankbaits, but we'll talk about topwater, lipless crankbaits, twitch baits, stick baits, how to place those weights in those different kinds of lures to get the best action and the most stability. So first, let me just do a quick disclaimer. Everything I'm talking about here are generalities. Lures, believe it or not, are dynamically pretty complex. There are way too many variables in designing a lure to actually cover in any one or even 10 videos. So I'm going to keep the information as generic and usable as possible, and just keep in mind that there are other ways to make a lure. I have had the comment out there that there's lots of people who make beautiful lures without using any physics whatsoever. And sure, you can do that. There's always the trial and error method, and that's a perfectly legitimate way to go. And while none of this is going to be hard and fast rules, they're going to be really useful techniques and guidelines that'll get you closer to a really good working lure faster than if you just go trial and error. So first, let's cover the very basic thing. Why do you add weight to a lure? So the most obvious answer is to make it sink. Sometimes you just want it to suspend, or sink slowly, or rise slowly in the water column. So adding the weight, it really is primarily to affect buoyancy, but also to help with stability and to establish the attitude the lure will have as it's sitting in the water, whether it's tail down or head down. But placing the weight in the proper location can also enhance the action of the lure. And in the case of topwater lures, it can actually create the action that you really want. So on this little simple diagram of a crankbait, I have three critical points that we're going to talk about as this video goes along. The center of gravity, CG, the center of drag, C sub D, and for crankbaits, the center of rotation. That would be the sort of vertical line that a crankbait will kind of turn around. But when you're trying to actually attain stability in the lure, you're doing it by taking advantage of the fact that the lure is buoyant already. It wants to float. And if it doesn't float already, adding weight really doesn't do much for you for stability. And the reason for that is that you have, acting at the center of gravity, the force of gravity pulling down on the lure and the force of buoyancy pulling up on the lure. And that creates a sort of tug of war between those two forces that tends to want to hold the lure body vertical in the water so it doesn't rotate along its horizontal line. And that kind of stability helps with almost any kind of lure, especially dropping lures. Lures that fall through the water and you don't want them to sort of rotate on themselves and then falling leaf style go down through the water column. And of course, moving the weight forward or back on the lure will affect how it sits in the water statically, but also can affect how it runs through the water as you're retrieving it. So to achieve your maximum stability, you want to have the biggest differential pull on this tug of war. And to do that, you need to start off with as buoyant a material for your lure as you can. That's why a lot of folks use balsa. The harder and denser the wood is, the less buoyant it is, and the less stability you can actually achieve by adding weight. So for twitch baits, crankbaits, wide body stick baits, and swim baits, it's important to stay with light materials or make your lure hollow. So as you're designing your lure and you're getting to the point where you're done carving and shaping it, you really need to ask yourself, do I need to add weight? You don't always need to add weight. Sometimes the lure is small enough or maybe has some unique features to the design, like this one that has a dime for a lip, or this one that has just a massive metal lip. Those sort of design elements can either alter the amount of weight you could put in it or completely negate the need for any weight at all. For instance, I made some small minnow crankbaits out of popsicle sticks that had a narrow enough cross section that just the weight of the hooks and hook hangers was enough to give it the stability it needed, and they work fantastic. So don't jump to the conclusion that you have to have weight in your lure. Go through the process we're going to cover here and analyze it first. So once we've decided we got to have some weight in our lure, we need to know how much weight to add. Depending on what you're trying to achieve with your lure, and there's a lot of types of lures, That's going to inform the final actual amount of weight you're going to put in it. So the first step is to really find out how much weight to add just to make it neutral, just before it starts to sink. And there's a few ways to do that. The most common, I think, is the trial and error method, where you take a lure blank that you've already sealed so it doesn't absorb any water, put it in the water and see how it sits. And then hang some weight on it and see what the weight does. And keep adding weight and moving the location until the lure does what you want it to. But the trial and error method isn't always available. Sometimes you need to have those answers before you get too far along in your design, because maybe you can alter the shape, the size, and the initial volume of your lure to allow you to do what you want to. Because there are times that if you make the lure a little too small or don't have enough volume in the right place, you can't get the weight in the right place to get the lure to sort of sit the way you want it or even have the action you want. So sometimes there's got to be a little bit of sort of iterative design method. And at that point, doing the trial and error can get really labor intensive. So I prefer to find the initial amount of weight that I need through a couple of really simple mathematical methods. The first one I think is the most versatile because you don't have to have the finished lure in your hand. You can just use the information you have on the material you're using to make the lure. So maybe you're using maple and you just take a little block of the maple, measure its dimensions, length, width, and height. Take those dimensions, multiply them together to get the volume of the little wooden block or whatever material you're using, and use centimeters for your measurements, and that'll give you centimeters cubed. And now that you have the density of the wood that you carved your lure out of, you can just weigh your lure, and this one's exactly 14 grams, 14.00. So we're also going to need the weight of the hardware we're going to put on it, the tie-on-eye and hook hanger highs, the 2 hooks and split rings, and if you're going to have a dive bib on there, you need that too. And that gives us 4.63 grams. So since the lure is made from teak, we're going to use 0.7 grams per cubic centimeter as our density. So we take the weight of the lure, 14.0 grams, and divide it by the density of the wood, 0.7 grams per cubic centimeter, and the result is the volume of the lure, which is 20.0 cubic centimeters. Now, because the buoyant force is the weight of water that's displaced by the volume of the lure, and the volume is 20 cubic centimeters, and we know that water weighs 1 gram per cubic centimeter, we know that the buoyant force is 20 grams. So there has to be a negative force of gravity equal to that, 20 grams, just to get the lure suspending in the water. So that 20 grams is our target weight for the lure. But what we want to know is the amount of weight that we need to add. So you take our target weight and subtract the weight of the lure and the weight of the hardware, and that gives us the weight that we need to add just to get it suspending in the water. And then you'll have to add a little more or a little less depending on whether you want it to float or to sink. Let's move on to the next method of doing the same thing. It's a little simpler and just slightly more limited. First, we want to take a container that our lure blank will fit in without touching the bottom or the sides. And we put plenty of water in there so we can submerge the lure. Then I want to put just 1 or 2 drops of soap. Any kind of dishwashing soap will do. The soap is to break the surface tension so you don't get a bunch of bubbles settling on the surface of your blank, because the bubbles will definitely throw off the measurement. And if you've got a few bubbles in there already, just scoop them out with a spoon, and it's a good idea to let it sit just for a few minutes just to make sure there's no further bubbles in it. So now I'm just going to place the container on the scale, zero the scale, and then submerge the lure slowly into the water, making sure I don't touch the sides or the bottom, and making sure I don't get the holder in there either. And I get 20.00 grams. So that is a direct measurement of the volume of the lure, 20.00 cubic centimeters. But just like last time, we can use the gram equivalent as our target weight, 20.0 grams. And to find the amount of weight we need to add, we do the exact same math. So since the result of that test is exactly the same as the other one, we got 20.0 for our volume, and therefore the weight we need, the math ends up being exactly the same, and therefore the result for the weight we need to add is exactly the same. All right, so here's where the big payoff is for watching this video all the way to now. These are theoretical numbers. There are going to be errors intrinsic to both processes, both mathematical when you're doing all your measurements for your cube, and the process of submersion always includes some error. Now you can do it 3 or 4 times and do an average, but you almost always have some surface bubbles, and bubbles that are really too tiny to see. They get stuck in the hardware and along the skin of the lure when you're doing that. So what you have to do is make a correction to this number. And I'm going to give you those rules of thumb that I've come up with after a lot of experimentation in a little bit. I'll let you know what my factor is for getting it almost perfectly suspending, slow sinking, medium sinking, and fast sinking. We'll do that at the very end.
So I'm going to go ahead and weigh the lure again, and then add some random items for weights until I've got exactly 20.0 grams. That's our theoretical target, so let's see what that looks like in the water. I can pretty much guarantee it, it's going to float. Alright, so I've attached all the random weights, and then I'm just going to let it go in here. And you can see it floats pretty well, and even if I try to rub the lure to make sure there's no bubbles stuck to it, it still wants to float quite a bit. So let's see what it takes to get it to suspend. Alright, I've added a couple more little items for weight just to see where we put it. Let's see if it suspends. That's pretty doggone good right there. I would call that suspending. And before I actually get into how much weight there is on there, let's talk a little bit about suspending baits. Now, achieving a perfectly suspending bait is doable. I've actually had a video of a lure suspending for more than a minute, just sitting there. But it's the kind of equilibrium that is actually not stable. It's an unstable equilibrium. A stable equilibrium is like having a bowl and putting a marble in the middle of it. If you push the marble around, it'll just roll around the bowl and then settle back down to the bottom of the bowl. An unstable equilibrium is like you taking that bowl and turning it upside down and putting the marble on top, perfectly balanced. The slightest little movement and that ball is going to come off equilibrium and be gone. And that's the kind of thing you get with a suspending bait. Anything that changes in the environment for the bait, whether it's bubbles sticking to it, the temperature of the water going down or going up, maybe the water's salt water, or maybe it's just saltier water, or maybe it's just a lake with more minerals in it. Because it's such a delicate balance, anything will affect it. And that's why I don't waste a whole lot of time trying to get it perfect. I prefer to have my suspending lures be slow floating, so that when I crank it down, I can stop, twitch it, and let it sit. And I know while it's sitting there, it'll just slowly rise in the water column. For me, that's good enough. So let's see what the total weight was. 20.63 grams. So the difference between 20 grams and 20.63 grams is about 3.2%. So that falls right into my rule of thumb of correction factors to get it to suspend, which is between 3% and 5%. And I usually try to start right at the bottom of the scale at 3% to get really close to suspending or just slightly floating. So now I'll go ahead and give you all my correction factors for slow sinking, medium sinking, and fast sinking. But just keep in mind that those terms are going to mean different things to different people, different fishermen, and different ways of fishing. For me, a slow sinking lure is a lure that sinks at about 1 foot per second or slightly less. And medium sinking is anything above 1 foot per second to around 2 foot, maybe 2.5 feet per second. And then above 2.5 feet per second is fast sinking for me. But remember, most of my fishing is in really shallow water. For you deep water fishermen, that's going to be pretty different. For you guys fishing deep water, you're probably thinking that's way too slow. You guys want a rocket going down to the bottom. And you'll have to make your adjustments according to your need. But that'll be easy, because if all you want is for it to go fast, you just add a lot of weight. So the correction factor for slow sinking is anywhere between 5% and 15%. So you would be adding that percentage to the theoretical target weight. Medium sink would be 15 to 25%. And then of course fast sinking would be anything greater than 25%. So let me go ahead and show you what it looks like in the water tank with 5% increase. Let's see what it looks like. So just doing a quick calculation of the distance dropped and the time it took to drop it, it's about 1/4 foot per second, which is a little slower than I usually make my lures, because I like to make my lures usable in fresh and salt water. But that is a slow sinking lure. And it's weighted right at the lowest amount for the correction factor for a slow sinking lure. So I still have tons of stuff I want to cover on this topic, so we're going to have to break it up into 2 videos. But next time I'm going to cover the really salient details of where to put the weight that you're going to add depending on the kind of lure you're going to be using. Whether it's top water, lipless crankbait, lip crankbait, twitch bait, or stick bait, and even swim baits. And we'll be making those decisions based on where the center of gravity, the center of drag, and the center of rotation is. So we'll have to figure out where those are on our lures too. And hopefully this will give you a little bit of time to digest this information and maybe ask some questions in the comments. And that'll give me a little time to go over those questions, and maybe we can include the answer to those questions in part 2. If you're still jonesing for more of this kind of material, you should watch this video next. All right, thank you very much. Leave a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't. It's free. And come on, all this nerdy stuff is fun too. I'll see you guys on the next video.
Thank you.